Energy isn't just about workouts, it affects how we think, lead, recover, and show up every day.
Good question. If you're not having a lot of meat in the diet or fish in the diet, for whatever reason, costs, environment, whatever, there's a greater need to take
That's groundbreaking.
When you're tired and fatigued and sleep deprived and you take creatine, it reduces the deprivation effect of that sleep. Great question. If you're a vegetarian, you have very little creatine in the diet. If you're not taking supplemental creatine, you're just not going to get enough creatine in the diet. You're going to have more difficulty staying healthy as you age.
So as long as you get it in, it'll eventually find its way into the system. Do you think low creatine is an under-recognized public health issue?
Oh, great question. One day, everybody will be taking creatine.
If you're building long-term energy, real recovery, and mental clarity, subscribe, because the way you feel every day determines how you perform, and we break down what actually works on each episode. Welcome to Feel More Energy, a podcast about understanding the systems behind human energy. Today's guest is Dr. Richard Kreider, PhD. He spent decades leading human clinical research at institutions like Texas A&M, Baylor, and the University of Memphis, studying how exercise and nutrition shape performance, health, aging, and the brain. Today, I want to focus on what the data has actually taught us about energy and where most people still misunderstand it. One reason I wanted to have this conversation is that energy isn't just about workouts. It affects how we think, lead, recover, and show up every day. Dr. Richard Kreider, thank you so much for being on the podcast.
You're welcome.
After decades in this field, how do you personally think about your work today?
Well, I'm excited about the work today. When we started, we didn't have as much technology capabilities to do different type of assays and things to understand really what's happening in the body, in the muscle, and on health. And now with the explosion of technology for analysis and AI and other type of applications, we're just at the burgeoning of the new era of science.
That's amazing. What do you think's been the biggest breakthrough in technology that's allowed you to do more research and find new findings?
Wow, that's a good question. When I first started in graduate school, we really were just getting computers. So we did everything by hand, all the assays, everything had to be one-on-one, individualized, which obviously limited your ability to do studies. So now we can do research where we can collect data in a number of variables at the same time. So the speed at which we collect, the depth of which we are doing research, and then the ability to interpret all the systems of the body as we evaluate from how the body, physiology, the brain, cognition, all these things interact one with another is really exploded with the advancement in technology. So, I tell my students, back in the day, there was no PubMed search for literature. So you had to depend on whatever was at your library, and hopefully you had everything when you did a paper. Now everything's at your fingertip, basically. And if you do a good thorough review, you get all the research. You can find out what the gaps are. You can find out how other areas of science are looking at the same idea from a different perspective, and it opens up your eyes about what can be done. So it's really, it's an exciting time to be a scientist, especially looking at how exercise, nutrition, and health can affect well-being.
That's amazing. Yeah, especially with AI and all these amazing tools that are just coming out, just advancements are really helping humanity. When people experience low energy, where does that limitation usually show up first? In the brain, in the muscle, or at the cellular level?
I think it all starts in the cell. Your ability to produce energy is based on your energy systems. And when you are inactive or have certain diseases, you have a limitation in producing energy, which then shows up in poor tolerance, quick fatigue, not only physical fatigue, but mental fatigue. So I think it all starts in the cell. And if you optimize cellular energy production, you'll have healthy metabolism and everything kind of follows from there.
Absolutely. If energy were a system dashboard, what metric do you think most people completely ignore? And what are we still measuring poorly when it comes to energy?
Well, energy is a wide definition. It could be energy as in what you power, your car or your house with. But in the body, you're really talking about the primary source of energy and base of energy is really ATP. How can we produce adenosine triphosphate? That's the primary compound the body uses to break off the phosphate to produce this free energy to fuel everything that we have. So the ability to synthesize ATP, be able to replenish it at a high level really determines how much energy you can produce and how much energy you have to do daily tasks. So really, if you think about it as a dashboard, it's really, it's the gas that gets you where you got to go. You got to have a high efficient energy system and engine to be able to use that energy effectively so that you're not limited on your ability to perform or think or do your daily tasks.
Right. So ATP, if you could summarize that in one sentence, just for the people that may not understand, what would you refer to it as?
The basic source of energy in the body.
Talking about creatine now, creatine is still widely seen as a gym supplement. What's the biggest misconception that's prevented people from understanding what it actually is?
Well, I think that's what we're finding out over the last 30 years is there's a lot more applications of creatine than just providing extra energy to keep ATP levels high in the muscle. There are all types of health benefits from higher creatine in the diet. And again, it comes down to the energy. If you're providing ability to keep ATP levels high, you can perform. You can do all type of things. What creatine does is it has extra energy. It's a high energy phosphate bond, phosphocreatine. And that energy, when its phosphate's broken off, provides the energy to keep ATP going. So as we break ATP down, we got to resynthesize it real quickly. And that creatine in the muscle allows you to have energy to keep that cycle going. And so you
Right.
can last longer during intense exercise. You can think better, more clearly as you go out through your day. So really, creatine is the essential component. It's like a battery. It's a backup battery to the ATP.
That's amazing. And if you could delete one myth permanently, which would it be?
The creatine is just for athletes and people who are training. Creatine's for all ages, everything from the third trimester in pregnancy all the way till the oldest old of our population. The more creatine you have in your diet, the less health risk you have in many areas that we're now finding out. So it's for the lifespan. Creatine's for life. It's not just for working out.
Wow, that's really, for me, that's groundbreaking because so what you're saying is that even a fetus that's not yet born can benefit from creatine. Is that
Yeah.
right?
So it all starts with the mother. And as you get to the third trimester and the baby's really growing and developing neurological development and tissue development, the baby starts pulling more creatine out of the blood of the mother. And
Wow.
so we know that in animal studies, for example, that, and even in human studies, that creatine availability decreases. So there's a greater dietary need in women who are pregnant. And in animals, for example, they have fed animals creatine and then elicited asphyxia, which is like, you know, umbilical cord wraps around the neck and causes a lack of oxygen during the
Mm,
birthing process. And when they do that in a creatine fed animal, their survival rate is 40 to 50% greater. Why? Because you have energy in the brain to be able to back up the lack of oxygen and keep those cells vital through the birthing process. So, actually, from the third trimester, work being done down in Australia by Stacey Ellery and others are using it third trimester and even into the first few years of life, and even through breast milk to try to increase the creatine availability. Because we know kids with low creatine stores as they're born have a lot of cognitive deficits and neurological deficits. Kids that don't have the creatine synthesis enzymes that are born with a rare disease don't mature very well. It's almost like on the autistic spectrum. And so when they identify those kids and get creatine in their diet at high levels, they're able to mature and develop much more normal. Take children. Children with lower creatine in their diet, and Haynes' large database studies have now shown that kids with less creatine in their diet are shorter as they grow. They have higher body fat, less muscle mass. The girls, as they go through puberty, have more menstrual cycle issues. And as you age, we know creatine is very important to help maintain cognition as you get older. Muscle masses get older, neurological function, and even has been shown with rehab or exercise for people with diabetes and heart disease and hypertension to help control health status. And so that's why creatine's for the entire lifespan, no matter how old you are. In fact, as you get older, it's probably even more important to take creatine for general health benefits.
That's groundbreaking.
Before we continue, if you'd like to go deeper on this episode, we created a downloadable playbook that breaks down the key ideas from this conversation. It includes a brief transcript, the research we discuss, and the main insights that you can apply in your real life. You can download it in the description below. Now back to the episode.
Would you say creatine is synonymous with ATP? Or what's the simplest, correct way to describe creatine?
So ATP is the primary fuel, primary energy, and phosphocreatine is the kind of second backup to that. So when I do exercise, I break ATP down. I also break down phosphocreatine, and that energy is used to put the ATP back together again. So I'm constantly breaking down ATP for energy and putting it back together again for storage of energy. And the ability to replenish and cycle that ATP determines how long you can sprint before you start fatiguing, for example. Well, in tissues that have lack of oxygen, think heart, like heart disease, or ischemia in the brain, like with stroke. We know that animals, or even with concussion injury in the brain, that if you have higher creatine content and phosphocreatine content in the brain, for example, when it experiences lack of blood supply, like a stroke or an injury, it provides that energy to keep ATP levels up so you don't have as much damage to tissue. So, for example, they've done studies in animals where they fed creatine or not, and then they evoke a concussion. Kind of conk them on the head, create this concussion, and then monitor whether the animals fed creatine or placebo had as much damage or as much neurological deficits. And when you take creatine in these animals, they typically have about 30 to 50% less damage. They've done that same thing with ischemia, like stroke, causes stroke, have much less damage in the brain. They've done things with heart, where if your heart can use the energy, and when it's ischemic, it helps the heart function better. And when this heart has ischemia, lack of oxygen supply due to atherosclerosis or something, the cells that around that, dying tissue from a heart attack, for example, there's a bunch of cells around it are like ischemic. And if you can actually provide energy at that point in time, you lose less size of the infarct. So people who've had heart attacks with creatine actually have smaller size of the heart attack, which means you maintain better function. So we're now knowing, and there's all these type of diseases that are called mitochondrial dysfunction diseases, where something interferes with the mitochondria. That's the powerhouse in the cell. That's where you produce all the ATP from aerobic metabolism. When things interfere with that process, you then are reliant on ATP and phosphocreatine as a backup energy system. So creatine kind of serves as a backup battery for energy. So when there's not enough oxygen, it kicks in like the power goes out and your generator goes on. And that's kind of how creatine works with some of these diseases.
Now, that's a beautiful explanation. That really makes sense as a backup battery. I really like that analogy. So creatine has resurfaced in the last few years. Feels like everybody's talking about it. Cognition, aging, clinical, you know, what actually changed in the science, right? Was there a specific finding that shifted the field? And what are people still even missing now?
Well, I think the data's been there, but the attention hasn't. Why? Because the perception is, well, this is just something for a weightlifter and athlete to take. And in 2020 or so, we formed a group called Creatine for Health. You go online, creatineforhealth.com. We got lots of things about creatine on there. And we try to get the information about all these health benefits into the scientific literature and then into the popular literature, okay, and podcasts and things like that. And so we launched another creatine conference, but it was all focused on the health effects. And we published a paper, myself and Jeff Stout, on creatine for health and disease. And that overviewed all the different areas that creatine can play a role in people who have medical conditions, and all the studies that are being done, some of which are much more advanced than others, but emerging in others. And I think that paper and that special issue and that 21, I believe 22 conference we did on creatine, I think reopened the thought about all the creatine effects on health. So after we did that paper, I did a talk at the Active Sport and Active Nutrition Conference in San Diego. It's about to happen again. This was in 21 or so. And this is where a lot of the people who make supplements and who are always interested in new novel things, I presented all the health benefits of creatine. And the people there were amazed about the applications of creatine in all these different conditions. And I think that started, plus we did a very good website and started putting podcasts on and started putting presentations from all these top scholars in easy to understand language. And I think that's kind of exploded the interest in creatine and use in dietary supplements worldwide throughout the lifespan. And so you look at the sales, I don't have anything to do with sales of creatine, but they've like tripled. We can't get
Right.
enough creatine, high quality creatine made quick enough, because everybody's understanding that it's for women, it's for aging, it's for cognition, it's for people with chronic diseases that might help them manage the disease better. And so it's been fun, but I think it was kind of an effort to get the word out to the medical community, get the word out to the public. And with the onset and development of very good websites and media and social media efforts, I think the word's gotten out, and now creatine's, as popular and of interest as ever been, actually.
Absolutely. No, thanks so much for your work and for getting the word out there. I'm the same way, following your work and following the studies and everything that's put out there. I tell everybody around me, I'm offering them creatine. Like, hey, let's all toast for creatine.
Mhm.
So I'm with you. So where do you see it? Do you still think we're scratching the surface? Is there still a lot of room to grow?
Oh, yes. So here's what's going to happen to creatine. We're going to continue doing research on various medical conditions and find out whether creatine does or does not help in the therapy of patients. If there's therapy that involves physical exercise, maintaining muscle mass, maintaining power, even cognition, which almost all diseases have an impact on, creatine can have an adjunctive role. So I think you're going to see a lot more recommendations from physicians to use creatine as a preventive supplement approach as well as a rehabilitative approach. So that's one thing. I think because of the interest in creatine, you're going to start seeing creatine fortified into foods.
Amazing.
So, for example, if you're a vegetarian, you have very little creatine in the diet. If you're not taking supplemental creatine monohydrate, you're just not going to get enough creatine in the diet. You're going to have potential lessening of more difficulty staying healthy as you age. So how do you get that into the population? Well, creatine primarily comes from meat and fish, And so if I start supplementing or fortifying plant-based proteins with creatine, or put creatine into things that everybody consumes every day, like we'll throw it in our coffee or, or juice or whatever, um, I think you're going to see a lot more of those type of application. I also think you're going to start seeing advertisements on foods that contain creatine.
That's the future.
We got a grant with the National Pork Board, and we were looking at different types of protein, pork protein, which is very high in essential amino acids and creatine versus plant. And we looked at recovery and military type people, and they recovered faster because they had higher quality protein as well as some creatine. So now we're thinking, well, if that type of pork has very high quality creatine, what do all the different cuts have, and how's that compared to other type of foods? And I think what you're going to see is, our 1 gram of creatine per serving type of thing on some products, because people are aware, hey, I need creatine in my diet. And fortifying foods that aren't as expensive, creatine monohydrate is not that expensive, might be a more affordable alternative. I even think you're going to see third world countries, when we give food additives to make sure it has quality protein, it's got to have some creatine in there too. And so I think you're going to have an explosion of worldwide interest and use of creatine in lots of variety of ways.
That's exciting. That's very exciting. Want more strength, better recovery, and sharper mental focus? Creatine is one of the most studied supplements in sports performance. It supports the cellular energy system that powers your life. Feel More Energy Creatine delivers 5 grams per serving, simple, clinically dosed, more output, better performance. Build your energy system today. Visit feelmoreenergy.com. If you had to make an estimate on the population as a whole, right, in the world, or we can choose the United States, whatever is easier for you, what percentage do you think of the population in the US is consuming adequate amounts of creatine?
Well, there have been some studies from NHANES, that's a large database that looks at health outcomes over many, many years, out of Boston. And we know that, for example, the average creatine intake in the adult is only about 0.5 to 1 grams per day on their diet. And we think you need 2 to 3 grams minimum for health. Okay. We know, for example, that there have been some trends recently in adolescence where kids are growing up thinking, well, I don't want to have certain types of foods because of the, lots of different environmental issues or whatever it might be. And so they're going away from meats and those type of foods. And so their creatine content in their diet's gone down to now 0.25 grams per day or 0.5 grams per day. And we know that's not even close to being what the body needs. And so they're almost becoming more vegetarian. Vegetarians have a greater response to creatine because they start out with lower. And so I think we know that the average amount is around less than 1 gram. And we also know that in people who have more than 1 gram per day, there's less cognitive decline as you age. There's less neurological brain degeneration as you age. There is better or less instance of liver and other type of disease progression as you age. There's better muscle mass and strength and less body fat in kids who have higher creatine in it. So I think what's going to happen is the population is getting to realize creatine is kind of a conditionally essential nutrient, and you have to have in your diet in some way. And whether you're consuming foods that are fortified with creatine or taking supplemental creatine or eating enough fish and meat per day to meet that need, it's important. And I think what's going to also happen is we're going to see creatine being listed as a conditionally essential nutrient that needs to be in the diet at a minimum level of about 1 to 1.5 grams per day, just to meet basic, metabolic functional needs as you age. But again, we always recommend at least 2 to 3 grams for health. And we actually are now, for cognitive effects, we'll probably talk about this later, giving more. We're giving 10 grams a day in older folks for cognition, and we can explain why later.
Absolutely. Yeah. I want to unpack that a bit more. You said a lot of, interesting things there. I want to start first from, the diet because yeah, a lot of people have different diet preferences for multiple reasons. But from a dietary perspective, creatine typically, like you said, comes from consuming animal proteins. So how do creatine considerations differ for people that aren't consuming as much animal protein, possibly a vegetarian or a vegan? What do they need to be looking for?
So the less each pound of meat or kg of meat contains about 2 to 3 grams of creatine. So if you need 2 to 3 grams a day, you need to be eating about 1 to 2 pounds, almost a kilo of meat or fish per day. Salmon, for example, has great content of creatine. That's expensive, and a lot of people can't do that. And so if you're not having a lot of meat in the diet or fish in the diet, and for whatever reason, costs, environment, whatever, there's a greater need to take supplemental creatine. And the reason is because you have to have at least that 2 to 3 grams per day to meet what the body needs for just general health and protection from things like concussions and other things that may occur, in individuals. So it's more important if you're on a lower meat-containing diet.
Absolutely. Yeah, and it's almost unsustainable to eat, a kilo of meat a day, with the time, the cost, it's just, not realistic for most people.
So compare the costs. So we did a recent paper, and there were some efforts in the United States to limit creatine, ability to buy creatine unless you're over 18. And a bunch of the scholars said, well, that's the worst thing you can tell kids because their diet is low. Okay. And a teaspoon of creatine at normal rates cost right now is about 2 to 3 cents per gram. So if you took 5 grams per day, you're talking 10, 15 cents. Okay. Compare that to a pound of meat. And depending on the type of meat that you consume or fish, it can be $4, $5, $6 a pound, up to $20, $30 a pound. Well, what's more cost effective? To add a little bit of creatine monohydrate to your food or drink per day and make sure you get plenty, just like a one a day type of supplement. And that's a much more affordable way. So there have been folks trying to say, well, you shouldn't take it unless you're 18. It's like, there's no data. In fact, the data shows it's better in kids, okay, and they need it. And so we shouldn't be restricting the availability of creatine. We should be finding ways to get more creatine at appropriate dosages in the daily diet so people aren't as dependent on supplements, or make the supplements so affordable that it's like, well, that's the easiest way to get it, is just add a teaspoon of creatine monohydrate and I get my 3 to 5 grams per day and I'm getting my health benefit.
Absolutely. Where you're fueling life. You're fueling
Exactly.
the world and all these great things that we need to be able to progress as a society. So
Yeah,
and who's coming up with that? Who's building the case for that people under 18 shouldn't have creatine?
There is a group out of Boston, one of the universities up there, that is trying to relate any use of dietary supplements to eating disorders in kids. So if they start taking a supplement per day, the next thing they know, they're going to take some, supplements to make them lose a lot of weight. Next thing they know, they're going to be bulimic and anorexic and have all types of problems. It's just not good logic. Okay. There's even been a paper saying, well, weightlifters are more susceptible to taking anabolic steroids, right? Maybe a higher percentage of weightlifters take, but that doesn't mean that everybody takes it. That's like saying, well, their claim was, well, we shouldn't be permitting or promoting weightlifting because it's the weightlifting that's causing people to think to build muscle, which makes them think to try to take steroids. Well, wait a minute. Those weightlifters often drive to the gym. Is driving now a precursor to? It's like there's no logic to this. And
it's pretty comical.
There is a group that's pushing this from an eating disorder viewpoint. And nobody supports eating disorders. However, if a person has eating disorder, they're losing muscle mass. And that loss of muscle mass and not enough nutrients interfere with things like electrolyte availability and heart ability to contract. One of the things you could do to slow or help that person during that difficult time of trying to control that is get them the nutrients their body needs to be able to function better. And creatine's one of those. I'll give you another example. I was up in same Boston area, and they're talking the same type of thing about maybe 10 years ago. They brought me up to the congressional thing in the state and said, and I was one of the experts, and said, we're going to try to ban any type of muscle building supplement before 18, which also includes proteins and protein bars. And they're not worried about Starbucks coffee, which has lots of calories and junk in it, but they are worried about a whey protein or a creatine powder. Okay. So I got up there, and right before I was there, they had a panel, was on the same panel, and they're talking about how they need to increase funding for the state to hire more athletic trainers to help them manage all the concussions that are happening with contact sports. And it's dangerous, and we got to prevent it, and we got to reduce it, and need more education. And I said, before I gave my statement, I said, one of the best things you can do to reduce the risk and severity of concussion is allow the athletes to take creatine, which you're trying to ban. And they're like, oh, okay. They ended up not doing it. But there's some states, they have folks that kind of think they need to push these things. And unfortunately, it doesn't make any scientific sense. And so we end up having to respond and send letters and have 50 people sign and say, this is what the science says, folks. And so unfortunately, sometimes politics doesn't follow the science, as we've learned over the last 5 or 6 years.
Absolutely. No, they set you right up, especially with the concussion one, right? That really threw out the argument out the window, I could imagine. So what does, I know you said your metaphor, right? You described that creatine like filling a gas tank. What happens when that tank stays low, especially for many years?
Okay, so if you think of a normal diet without any supplement and a gas tank, most people on a normal diet that includes meat and fish have about 60% full gas tank. If you're a vegetarian, it may only be 40 or 50%, okay? And so what you're trying to do with creatine supplementation, particularly loading or high-dose creatine, is to fill that gas tank up with more creatine and phosphocreatine, so you're at 100%. So you have energy reserve and ability to do all type of activities and have enough energy to do them for a longer period of time and recover faster from those interval type of high intensity bouts. And so it's all about getting more energy in the cell. And by doing that, you can do your daily functions, you can do your workouts, you can have better stamina throughout the day, and because you have more energy. And because you have more energy, you can withstand things like stroke and concussions and ischemia situations, or some type of mitochondrial dysfunction in the cell. You can withstand them better with that energy than without. And so all those things, there's even data now to show that some tumors are dependent on creatine to slow the growth.
Wow.
And by adding creatine, you reverse the negative metabolic cascade to promote the tumor growth. And so there's all this medical data coming out with how we're figuring out what there's even data showing that creatine's intimately involved in intestinal absorption of nutrients, and people with things like irritable bowel syndrome or Crohn's type diseases that have digestive issues seem to do better when they have more creatine in the diet, so that helps with the intestinal absorption of those nutrients under those conditions. So we're learning more about it. It's not 100% in all situations, but we're learning all these potential metabolic roles that creatine plays a vital role in. If you think about it, every cell in the body requires ATP and phosphocreatine. That's the first primary energy system for the body. And if you're feeding that energy, you're going to have much better metabolic function.
It sounds creatine. I want to get later on into this, but I want to know, the arguments against it, but I'm sure we'll get into that. When energy improves, what do people usually notice first? Is it the mental stamina, physical resilience, or recovery from stress once they have that tank full?
If you creatine load, the first thing you notice is your ability to do high intensity exercise improves. So what I mean, you can do higher intensity exercise more repeated, like say a set of 8 or 10 repetitions. You can do more weight and you can finish the set easier. Okay. So you can end up doing more volume. That's usually the first thing people see and notice, because within a week, you can notice the more energy, more endurance capacity when doing things like weightlifting or something like that.
What about somebody that may be not in the gym? What would they first notice? Just an everyday person that's maybe not an athlete.
Yeah, they wouldn't be as fatigued. They can get through the day with more energy. They can do their normal physical activities, whether it's walking or picking up the, groceries or doing the laundry, all those type of daily activities. It's easier because you get more energy. It's like getting fit. When you get higher fitness level, it makes everything easier. So you have a perception of, hey, this is no problem. I'm not as tired. I'm not as fatigued. I can do more. And creatine's the same way. And you notice anything like if I had to pick up groceries and put them in the shelves, and after a while, my arms get tired, right? You're not going to get as fatigued as quickly. So even the basic beginner will notice effects. And we just got done doing study papers and review. We've done studies in trained and untrained. But in untrained people aren't training, they get stronger, they get more muscle, they get better cognitive function without even training. So I think that's the next horizon too, is, hey, man, this works even if you're not doing anything. And we did like weightlifting tests and stuff, and even without training, they were able to do more weight, more reps, just with the energy and without any training.
Yes, it's powering the cell, all the cells. So it makes sense why you would have more energy even if you're not training. Where can people go look at all your studies? I want to make sure, you share that for the people listening.
Yeah, so there's a couple places. One is the best place, depository of creatine information right now is that website I mentioned, creatineforhealth.com. We've got a website. We've got 50 or more YouTube posts online, YouTube, Creatine for Health. And this allows you to access all the information. We have a lot of the review articles and updates and things on there. So that, if I would say one source for creatine information that's from the top scholars getting the information out to the public, that would be the place I would go. And then in addition, you can find, actually, you put my name in and put creatine or any, nutrition, you'll find lots and lots of articles and things from there. We have a lab website called Exercise and Sport Nutrition Lab.com, and Exercise and Sport Nutrition Lab.com. And on there, we post interesting papers and our publications and our podcasts and all these type of things you can find online.
Absolutely. We'll make sure we put some of those links down below in the description. Low energy, the problem might be your breathing. When nasal airflow is restricted, oxygen drops. Less oxygen means lighter sleep, slower recovery, and lower output the next day. Breathe more opens your nasal passages instantly. More airflow, better sleep, better performance. Upgrade your breathing today. Visit feelmoreenergy.com. Dr. Kreider, when I hear that, all the research you've done, you've dedicated decades of your life to the service of others, in regards to creatine. The first thing I think is all this are resources and money. Could you kind of hint at how much, this research along all these years and, to compile these things, how much does that in monetary value, does that actually mean?
Well, it's hard to quantify because every study takes years to do. Okay. And even if you get a grant, that doesn't cover all the time and effort of all the students. So let's take one paper.
Right.
We just did a paper on creatine and side effects. We went through every clinical trial, 685 clinical trials, to look at whether there's any mention of any side effects for people taking creatine and placebo. 26,000 people were in these studies, okay? And then we do the big analysis and we went through and listed every study. That probably took us 2 years of consistent effort from a team of about 5 or 6 people to do, okay? Um, Graduate students, I'm funding them different ways, but they're working on this and I'm working on it. Just one study. Okay. Most people don't realize when you do one study, it takes about a year to get funding and planning, IRB approval, another year or two to do it, another about a year to publish it. So you're talking tens of thousands of hours of human resource. So that's a long say. It's a lot, okay, to do this. It's a career. And I've had over 70 PhD students come through my lab. And I've had, and some of them are world renowned now in their focus areas. And I've had hundreds and hundreds of graduate students and undergraduate students work in my lab over the years. Every one of them has made an impact on the productivity. And a few years ago, I did a assessment of all the students and key contributors in my lab and how many papers have been published from this exercise sport nutrition effort that we started about 40 years ago, coming up on our 40th year. And over 4,000 papers have been published, over 200,000 citations of that work. It's enormous. And if you look at how much actual money we've been funded about 32, 33 million over those years to do various studies, but that doesn't count half of the effort because everybody does this on their own as well. So it's a passion, it's not only creatine, it's all other type of nutrients we've studied over the years. And one of the reasons our lab is looked at as one of the top in the world is because we look at things, evaluate, do studies on things that seem to have some good scientific basis to, and then we do the studies and publish the results. And if it works, great. If it doesn't, we learn from the next one. And so you look at that body of papers and body of work, it's an enormous effort. It's not just me, it's all of my staff and graduate students and volunteers that have worked on all of our studies over many, many years to be able to make that type of impact. Very blessed to have such great group of people behind us to help us get this information out.
Absolutely. No, thank you so much for putting that into context. Like you said, it's really the dedication and the commitment to the work, the passion, and most people don't realize that. And thank you for putting that into context. But why does having more creatine change how the body adapts over weeks and months and not just how one session feels, right? What actually compounds over time?
Yeah, I think the best example of that is brain function. About 20% of circulating creatine can get into the brain through the blood-brain barrier. So creatine monohydrate, creatine's not great to go into the brain. So that's why we recommend larger daily doses for brain impact. And we're doing currently study 5 grams twice a day in middle-aged and older individuals for cognitive benefit, okay? So we know that over time makes an impact. And the longer you take creatine and the more it increases brain creatine, the better cognitive benefits you have. Versus if I'm looking just for an increase in performance, I can load 20 grams a day, 5-gram doses per day for 5 to 7 days, and I can see immediate muscle performance effects, endurance, those type of things. But for some of these health benefits, particularly for the brain, it takes longer to have an impact. And so, and there's even data, for example, studies out of Canada and Darren Kandow and their group show that over a year or two, those taking creatine and doing resistance training had less loss of bone in postmenopausal women. And so those are longer type of effects. And what's giving us a clue about these lifetime effects is that NHANES database that are looking at age effects. And people who had taken creatine, had higher creatine in their diet, for example, score better on cognitive function when they're 60 to 70 on tests, have less neural damage as they age if they had higher creatine in the diet, have better function and less disease, certain type of diseases, heart and liver, et cetera, seem to be a lower incident in people who have higher creatine diet. So those are long-term lifetime effects. And that reiterates the importance of not only just taking creatine to build muscle and to get muscle performance, but there's lifelong effects of having a higher amount of creatine in their diet. And again, we think that about 2 to 3 grams is the minimum. And then you go beyond that, you might get some additional benefits over time.
Yeah, it really sounds like it's intended for extended use, right? It's not, kind of like
for a lifetime. Creatine supplementation for a lifetime.
Creatine for life. I love that.
Yeah, and it's also, like I always tell folks, people think it's just for young and active. It's probably more important the older you get, because that's when you start noticing cognitive decline. That's when you start noticing muscle mass loss. That's when you get weaker. And we know that if you're older and you lose 10% of your muscle mass, you're more susceptible to falls, balance issues. If you break your hip, it's not a good prognosis after that. And so keeping people strong, healthy, with plenty of muscle and functional capabilities as they age is key for longevity.
Lifetime, like you said, creatine for a lifetime. I love that. So I want to get into a myth, one of the bigger myths out there, right? This idea that creatine causes bloating or bad weight gain, it refuses to die. Can you walk us through where the water actually goes, why that distinction matters, right, physiologically, and how's that different from the kind of water retention people should actually be worried about? Walk us through that, because I feel like a lot of people have that water linked to creatine.
Yeah, unfortunately, when we first started doing studies on creatine, the change in muscle mass was pretty quick and profound, even resistance-trained athletes. So we know that when creatine goes into the cell, water goes with it, okay? So it's a way to increase hydration in the cell. When you increase hydration in the cell, it actually expands the membrane and it helps promote protein synthesis. It's called cell volumization. So things like creatine, glutamine, a few other things can help with that improvement. But initially say, well, it couldn't be muscle that quick. It's got to be water. And we kind of dispelled that myth early on because we'd measure water, intracellular, extracellular, and total with measurement of body composition using the X-ray DEXA method. And we always found that total water goes up.
Right.
But when you increase muscle mass, 80% of muscle is water.
Right.
Okay. So if I gain 10 pounds, I'm gaining water. And so we always found that the gain in water was proportional to the muscle gain. And there was a little bit of shifting into the cell where we can say total water went up and a little bit more went in the cell, which is exactly what you expect from creatine. And so we then had to do studies. Darren Willoughby and a few others did studies where they looked at muscle biopsies, and they were able to confirm that the muscle mass gain we're seeing in our X-ray body composition methods was actually more muscle and protein on the muscle fiber, got them thicker. And then it's like, oh yeah, this is muscle. And so the thought is that the initial change may be a little water, but then that lays more protein down. And when you're doing training with greater quality of training, that leads to more muscle mass that's really muscle at the end of the training. So it's a myth that, oh, it causes bloating. Studies that are being done more recently in women in creatine, because that's where a lot of women say, oh, I shouldn't take creatine, I'm a bloat. I don't want to bloat. Actually shows that it's not the bloating that they associated with in the subcutaneous type feeling. It actually is helping during the menstrual cycle. And there's right before you have menses, right before your period, there's actually a greater need for protein, a greater need for creatine. Okay. And they're actually doing studies. Abby Smith Ryan at the University of North Carolina doing studies where they're timing creatine during the menstrual cycle to see if they get a better training adaptation. And we're also monitoring whether it causes or reduces symptoms of PMS, because the gain is not the bloating you get with your period, for example. So that's one of the myths out there, that it's just water. No, it's actually muscle, particularly if you're doing resistance training.
So to summarize it, somebody that's saying, hey, I feel bloated, it's water, your response would be?
It's not. So perfect example. Okay. We just did that 685 study, right? Comparing those taking placebos versus those taking creatine. And we did some of this stuff early 2000s as well. People taking placebos had more complaints about bloating and GI upset and those type of, than the people taking creatine.
Yeah.
So it could be lots of things where people perceive, but the instance of, it's not really the creatine causing it. It could be something else, but it's not the creatine, because we now know in large databases with thousands of people in them that there's no extra instance of bloating or cramping or any of these type of side effects that are reported. Actually, in many cases, are lower when you take creatine.
Wow. It might just be the misinformation, right? You hear someone saying it and then they take it as the truth, and then it gets spread, and then,
Yes, that, and there's also companies trying to take advantage of their newer form of creatine. Ours doesn't cause bloating. Ours doesn't cause cramping. Ours doesn't cause this or that. And my response is no study has ever shown any of that. In fact, it's the opposite. Perfect point. Creatine causes cramping or dehydration. No, the studies actually looked at this, show that extra creatine, because of the greater water fluid retention, helps you handle exercise in the heat. It reduces thermal stress. It slows down dehydration and reduces cramping in athletes performing at high intensity in very hot and humid environments. But you hear the myth. So we actually have published a couple papers on the myths of creatine and debunking them that Joe Antonio led with the International Society of Sport Nutrition. I'm one of the co-founders. And so we put two papers out. Well, first one out was very well received, and then there were still more questions. So we added another volume 2 of it. And if you go to those papers, you can see all the things they say about creatine, and none of them has really shown any effect in any of the studies. So unfortunately, you got companies trying to make advantage. You got misinformation. You got the urban myth or so from a trainer or athlete. So I took it and my stomach was giving me a hard time. Okay. One quick example.
That's so funny.
Yeah, we did this. We started doing our safety stuff because we did all these studies in the late 90s at the University of Memphis with our football team. And we were one of the first teams. We were the first one in the United States to use it. Resistance trained athletes. And so we said, let's put it on, give it to our football players and do some studies. And we had all our athletes on creatine. We were taking 25 grams a day with protein powders.
Right.
Not during loading, continuously. Okay. And
they were loving it.
Yeah. We were getting to fall camp, and our coach decided, instead of doing initial conditioning test of, 2 sets of 8 110s, 110 yard sprint with 15 seconds or so or less, and then 30-second recovery, do a set of 8, then rest 5 minutes, do another set. We're going to do 3 because we're going to prove that we're the toughest, best team in the country, right? So first set, everybody blows through, no problem. They're in good shape. These D1 top athletes. And then you go to the second, about the third, start really having issues slowing down. If you start cramping up, get to that third set, man, it was like a MASH unit. They're all down, right? They're like, it's like trainers running over here for cramping and over here for cramping. And the coach says, well, we got to get in better shape. We're going to, I thought we were more dedicated than that type of thing. And he says, oh, by the way, we heard from another university that they were experiencing cramping when their athletes taking creatine. How many people are taking creatine? And, we had half on, half off, so a bunch of people put their hand up. Oh, okay. Well, I know doc says it's okay. There's no problem. Let's just, for camp, the 2-a-days, let's back off it and we'll tell you to get back. Oh, wait a minute. How many are cramping who are taking creatine?
Right.
All the people cramping were not on creatine.
Wow.
And all the other athletes say, man, how do I get that creatine? Perception doesn't always follow the science. So we actually did studies. That's the classic on safety of creatine. Every athletic training complaint, treatment, injury for almost 2 years, we monitored in those athletes. And guess what we found? The incidence of cramping was less. The incidence of muscle pain, strains and pulls were less. Head injuries were less. We didn't know about concussions back then, so we just knew classified as all as head trauma. We went through almost everyone is similar or lower than the people taking placebos. And so the perception doesn't equal out. And now with all the data out there, you can look at every one of the complaints. The placebo is worse almost every condition. So you just got to stop taking placebos and take creatine.
Yeah, absolutely. No, and the studies are there, right? You've done the studies. Last question on that water topic. Do you need to take more water when you're taking more creatine, or is your normal intake fine?
You hear this all the time. Somebody on Instagram will say, yeah, it doesn't cause a problem, but just drink enough water. Creatine is a hyperhydrator.
Right.
If you take creatine with glycerol, it actually is a hyperhydration technique that works better than glycerol alone. Okay?
Can you explain what glycerol is just for the people?
Glycerol is a fat that you put into fluids. It causes fluid retention. So for people who cramp a lot or dehydrate, have a lot of high sweat rate, one of the things you can do is to hyperhydrate them before activity and have them drink glycerol in their water as they're preparing for an event or game or whatever. And we know that if you add creatine to that, you can get better effects. And so creatine alone helps with thermoregulation, reduces dehydration. But when you add it with water or with glycerol, it even is better. So you don't have to drink more water.
Right.
Because it's helping you retain a little bit of the water that you're consuming. It doesn't cause dehydration. It slows it down. It doesn't cause thermal stress. It reduces it. And so you don't need extra water with creatine. You always need water if you're going to be active. That's always a good habit to say. It's not bad to say, but you don't need extra just because of creatine.
Thank you, doctor. You guys have it here. You guys heard it from Dr. Kreider himself. These myths out the window. So now let's talk about the cognitive, right? Why does the brain seem to benefit from creatine differently than the muscle? And what surprised you the most when the cognitive data first started appearing?
Good question. So why is it different? Every cell needs creatine. The brain uses phosphocreatine. So if you're trying to improve brain function, you have to have energy. And then as you age, you want to keep the oxidative stress low. You want to reduce inflammation in the brain. And you want to improve neurotransmission. That's how we improve cognition. So the studies actually have been around for a while on this. There were studies early 80s and 90s where kids were born with that creatine synthesis deficiency, where they couldn't make their own creatine. The body makes about half the creatine need, and it depends on the diet for the rest. And kids that don't have those enzymes don't make creatine, so they're completely dependent on the diet. And what happens in those kids is that their cognitive development is slowed. Their neuromuscular development is slowed. And so they are found after 2-3 years they're not progressing normally. Then they find out they have this deficiency, give them a lot of creatine. So we always knew that lack of creatine could affect brain function and cognitive development. And so in the early 2000s or so, some researchers decided to look at how creatine affects brain creatine content, so loading. And we knew that if you loaded for a week, you can actually increase the phosphocreatine in the brain, more energy in the brain. And then there were a few studies where they did the loading and they did cognitive function tests and found some relationship. And it's few studies here or there over the years, but over the last probably 5 to 8 years, there's been a much more interest in the role of creatine in the brain for cognitive function, especially in aging populations. And there were two things that drove that. One, we knew that creatine worked, but because it didn't absorb in the brain as quickly, we thought you needed a lot and we weren't sure about the dosages. And so some of the initial studies used a normal muscle, 5 grams a day, low maintenance dose, and didn't see much. But when you loaded, it had the effect. So they also found that the precursor to creatine, guanidine acetic acid, GAA, goes in the brain better and can form creatine in the brain because the enzymes are there to form creatine in the brain. And therefore, you can get a better effect on brain. So there were studies around 2015, 16 comparing creatine and GAA with or without it, showing a little bit of it. That kind of increased the interest again. That was from Ostajic's colleagues from Serbia. And so now everybody's interested in the cognitive effects, but we don't know dosages. And so we think that needs to be more than a typical loading and maintenance, 20 grams a day for a week, 5 grams a day to maintain muscle. Muscle and brain are different. Different tissues may have greater needs for creatine. And so we're now doing 10 grams a day, 5 grams twice a day for cognitive effect. And even there's some studies now, a 30-gram single dose of creatine, 30 grams, helps delay when you're tired and fatigued and sleep deprived and you take creatine, it reduces the deprivation effect of that sleep. So in special forces, for example, who have to stay up for 36 hours, if they take a single bolus of creatine, in addition to having creatine in their diet, it gets in the brain and it seems to help slow down the deleterious effects of lack of sleep. And when they get done 36 hours later and do cognitive function tests, they're able to do it much better. One dose. And so we're finding all this stuff. And part of that is we now have, magnetic resonance spectroscopy technology that can measure these things in the brain. And so it's kind of accumulated with technology too. So now the current thought is 10 grams a day in middle age and elder. And we're just got data in that's being reviewed now showing untrained and trained. Is there a better effect with training? And both see benefits. And cognition as well as muscle gain and performance gains, a little bit better with training, which makes sense. But even if you're not training, you get some, and at least it's 10 grams a day.
When is it fine to take creatine a little bit towards I know you talked about sleep, right? Maybe someone hasn't slept, but what would you recommend it more? And I want to get a little bit deeper into dosing and timing and things like that, but is it fine to take it later on throughout the day? Is it going to affect sleep?
There's a little bit of evidence in our study we did with these middle-aged folks that people who take creatine aren't as tired at the end of the day and find it a little bit more difficult to fall asleep because their brain's working a little bit better. And we also did a study that's also in review where we had creatine and then we added that other precursor, GAA, 1 gram twice a day. And we also found that kind of sleep effect. So basically your brain is more functional and you're not as tired. And so you may not need as much sleep if you take creatine. And so that may be a good thing. People, they're not as tired at 9 or 10 o'clock. They feel more energy, and obviously you get benefits from sleep. You don't want to reduce your sleep, but there seems to be some enhancement with sleep that we're still trying to figure out. But if anything, it probably makes you less sleepy and less tired when you're taking creatine. So when you take that, if you take it twice a day in the morning, and 8 a.m., 8 p.m., something like that, then you're getting it kind of dispersed throughout the day. I can't tell you that 8 p.m. dose makes it harder to sleep. I don't know that yet. But we do know from people taking 10 grams a day, at least from our initial studies that are under review right now, in middle age and older people, that active nutrition group, that active sport nutrition population, that they seem to report a little bit more difficulty going to sleep. They sleep deep, but it's a little harder, maybe because the brain's more functional. I don't know. So we still have to figure that out.
Okay, that's amazing. Waking up tired, it might be mouth breathing. Poor breathing at night limits recovery. Sleep More is a gentle mouth tape that supports nasal breathing while you sleep. Deeper recovery, better mornings. Upgrade your sleep tonight. Visit feelmoreenergy.com. Now I'm curious about this one because a lot of listeners are dog owners, and I have a dog myself. You did mention creatine has been studying in animals, but what about dogs? What does that research actually tell us? Like, should we be giving? Because I think that all the time, right? I take creatine, and I'm like, should I give my dog creatine? What insight do you have there?
I haven't seen as many studies on whether dogs should take creatine. We certainly know that good nutrition improves the health of your dog and animals. You give them quality proteins, their coat and all those things improve. From an energy standpoint, certainly having a little bit of extra creatine is not going to hurt. Maybe a half a gram or so a day or so. I don't know. You'd have to figure out how much they would need. May not be much, but high quality protein, high quality, a little bit of creatine probably would be helpful. I've just not seen studies specifically in dogs and given creatine and look at how they adapt. Well, wait a minute. Now I do remember. Back in 1909.
1909, right. I heard that from you. Yeah.
Yale University, the first studies done at Yale were in dogs. And they found that they gained more weight and more physically active when they were taking and given creatine. That then led to a couple of the researchers to try it themselves and also report more work capacity. That was the first inkling. And then they noticed that when they gave creatine with carbohydrate, that there seemed to be a little bit better effect. We know creatine helps with carbohydrate storage, and they work together to help store. And so, back in 1909, there was that one study. I haven't really looked specifically, but it makes a lot of sense.
Right. Yeah, maybe you'll follow up on that, right? Where do smart, well-intentioned people misunderstand, creatine as far as because some people fixate on timing. Does timing actually matter? You just mentioned carbs. I've seen people mention salt, a little bit of salt. Can you give us some insight there on that?
Yeah, I think as long as you have a little bit of extra creatine throughout the day, it eventually is going to get to where it needs to get to. However, if you're trying to maximize the absorption, co-ingesting creatine with carbohydrate, about 20 grams or so, especially something that's a little bit simpler sugar like maltodextrin that increases insulin, can facilitate more creatine uptake, or taking with something that improves insulin sensitivity. Exercise does that, but other things like pentothal, things we've studied where we added to creatine seem to work a little bit better. Fenugreek extract, for example. So we always tell athletes or people who are taking creatine, if they're working out, we want to have a post-workout carbohydrate, high-quality protein snack or drink or bar or something after a workout. Why? Because you're going to want to allow for protein synthesis. You want to help with glycogen storage. Consuming carbohydrate and protein with creatine helps creatine absorption, and it helps carbohydrate storage. And so that's probably the best time to take it once you've loaded and got your levels up. And so the type of things you take, it can make an effect. Now, It's an extra 10%, 20%. You eventually will get there if you just take creatine. I put creatine in my coffee or with my, I use a probiotic green, all green type of supplement in the morning, throw it in with a drink and slam it down. It really doesn't matter. They've done studies where you've done before exercise and after exercise, which one makes a difference? I think it makes sense to do it after exercise with carb and protein because you get better absorption. But there's actually studies showing as long as you get enough in the day, it doesn't really matter.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, because that was another big one where people are like before, after. So as long as you get it in, I like how you said it'll eventually find its way into the system. So do you think the big picture, right? Do you think low creatine is an under-recognized public health issue at the moment?
I think we're learning that with those NHANES type of data, that people with low dietary intake, and that's usually about 0.8 grams per day or less, definitely less than one, seem to have higher incidence of a number of health issues. Now, is it cause and effect? Those are association studies we can't say, but it's curious that those studies also match some of the findings we're seeing from intervention trials. And so it just reiterates that you get a little bit of benefit short term, monitor 12 weeks, a year, whatever the study is, but there seems to be long term benefits of keeping your diet a little bit higher in creatine. What that actually is, whether it's at least 1 gram a day or optimally 2 grams a day, still is a little bit debatable. In fact, even with those NHANES estimates, they're based on 40-year-old tables that we developed. Not us, but they did in England with researcher there, Roger Harris and Balsam, and we haven't revised those. That's actually why we're doing that now. We're trying to update those. I think we'll get better data once we figure out exactly how much creatine's in different types of meats and fish and things in your diet, right. And then we might find actually, our estimates were low because we only thought there was a little bit of here, and that's all we counted. It's actually maybe a little bit more. I think we're going to be more than 2-3 grams would be the area where we start seeing health benefits over the long term.
That's amazing. And, I really stay with that phrase that you said, right? Creatine for a lifetime. And, from cradle to grave is what it sounds like. But, locking in the takeaways here, Dr. Kreider, if somebody only remembers 3 principles from this conversation, what should they be?
Creatine is essential for energy. Creatine is important throughout the lifespan. And creatine not only enhances performance, it also has a great impact on enhancing health.
Beautifully said. So as far as dosing, right, just to wrap up the dosing as well, how long, well, give me your simplest dosing rules, right? For baseline health, I know we've went over it, but so people can really lock it in cleanly. For baseline health, performance, and cognition, whether loading is required, how long does someone need to take creatine before the system really changes? And expanding on the question, do body size, age, activity meaningfully change how much someone needs? And, going back to the cognition and the physical performance, what should they be looking at there if you could just take that home as well?
All right, so a couple general principles. One, the larger you are, the more creatine you need to meet the daily needs and performance. We typically will recommend 0.3 grams per kg to load. So if you're 50 kilo, that's 15 grams or so. And if you're 100 kilo, a little bit, about twice as much, right? So you're talking almost 20, 30 grams.
Now, when you say load, is that necessary? Because, a lot of people also mentioned the loading. Like, what do you think there? I want you to unpack that a little bit more.
Great question. I think loading makes a lot more sense than just waiting for 6 to 8 weeks for the muscle to eventually get there. So where that came out, there's a study in the early 90s that showed that if you loaded 4 5-gram doses a day for 5 days, that increased creatine levels, or you can take 2 or 3 grams per day, and after about 5 weeks, you got about 80% of the loading dose. So long-term low dose, all right? If you want the benefits of creatine load, it doesn't hurt you, okay?
Right.
And we gave, like I said, our initial studies were 20 and 25 grams a day for 12 weeks, okay? No adverse effects. And so I always tell people, you want the benefits of creatine, load for a week. Then we suggest 0.1 grams per kg. So if you're a 50 kilo female, that's 5 grams. If you're a 100 kilo male, that's 10 grams a day. If you're a massive football player like we have in the United States, or 130, 40 kilos, they're going to need about 18 or so grams a day to meet their needs. So that's the general rule of thumb, with the exception, if you want brain effects, cognitive effects, we think you need to be at least 10 grams a day. And if you're a larger individual, maybe even more per day to get the creatine effect, unless you also take the precursor, GAA, which studies show you only need about 2 to 3 grams a day of that to get the same effects of creatine in the brain. So we don't know nearly as much about GAA. We're just doing studies on that. We do now have data showing that GAA with and without creatine can enhance cognition. There have been a few other studies that they've done. But I think we're going to end up where 5-gram dose of creatine plus 1 gram of GAA is the best for muscle and the brain twice a day. But we'll see.
That's amazing. Is that GAA, is that still something new? How would you describe GAA versus creatine? Is it like a sister compound, a cousin?
It's a precursor.
Precursor, okay.
And it gets in the brain better. And interestingly, GAA is used a lot in animal feed. So going back to the dog question, it may actually be better to give GAA to your animal. There are several products out there. People make Creapure also have something, it's like Amino Pure or something, but it's for animals. And it's mainly GAA because certain types of animals like chicken and those type of things do better on GAA than creatine. And so we know in humans that if you have 1 or 2 or 3 grams a day of GAA, it can increase your brain creatine content as much as loading dose. Wow. And so that's what we're trying to figure out. Maybe the muscle only needs 5 grams or 10 grams a day, 0.1 grams per kg. That's all the literature is on the muscle. How much does the brain actually need? And maybe we need, 0.15 grams. Interesting, if you look at all those 685 studies, which included diseased populations and healthy populations, the average, I think, was about 0.16 grams per kg per day for the studies that went up to 8 years in length. So that's even more than we're recommending, and that's what's been studied. So I think it's going to be a little higher dose than we think, or a combination of a little bit of GAA for the brain and creatine monohydrate for the muscle.
Yeah, I'm sure you guys will find that out, with the passion, commitment you guys have with everything going on. Training hard, progress requires consistency. Restore More is a performance tape designed to protect irritated areas and reduce friction during training. Less skin damage, fewer interruptions, more consistency. Train without setbacks. Visit feelmoreenergy.com. Why are there so many different forms of creatine, right? There's, I don't know how many forms, right? But why is that?
Money. People trying to improve upon something that was very popular. Creatine monohydrate's been the form that 95% of all studies have evaluated. But there's always been companies looking to find ways to help it mix better into water or fluid, help it be more stable in fluid, put it in gummies, all these type of things.
Right.
And if you look at, we did a paper in 22 on bioavailability of creatine as update. If you look at their different forms provide different amounts of creatine. So creatine monohydrate provides about 89% creatine per gram versus some of these others only provide 50, 60% creatine per gram. If you match the actual creatine to them, they should do about the same as long as it's delivered and gets actually creatine, goes in the blood and gets to the muscle. Not all of them do. And so why are they out there? Because everybody's trying to figure out a new way to build that mousetrap. Everybody's trying to find some new advantage. And a lot of times you see the advertisements because, it doesn't cause cramping or bloating, et cetera, et cetera. And none of that's true anyway.
It's just noise.
And it's noise and it's market advantage. And so they come out, creatine nitrate and creatine buffered and creatine all. If you actually look at the studies, we did a bunch of them comparing gram to gram, they usually don't do as well as creatine monohydrate. So why would you spend a lot more money for some of these newer forms when you can get for 3 or 4 cents a gram, you can get creatine monohydrate, high quality German pure creatine. And so it's marketing. Now, there are a lot of interest in, can we figure a way to make it stable in fluid for a long time? when you mix creatine in water or acidic drinks or, like juices, after about 3 to 5 days a week, you'll lose about 10% of your creatine content. It converts to creatinine. So everybody said, well, drink your creatine quickly. Don't put it in the refrigerator. Let it sit for a week. But that limits the ability to put it into a drink and then put it, market it in different heat and storage and all that stuff. So they're trying to find ways, can we protect the creatine, code it some way, protect the pH or whatever to be able to prevent the breakdown. And so there is some interest in that. I think that's kind of the newer technology, or be able to put it in gels. But, we had creatine gems, which is called, now they're gummies, but they were gems back in 30 years ago. We had creatine in pre-workouts, and we had creatine in, all types of products. There was even creatine in energy bars back 30 years ago. So these things have been done, but there's a lot of interest in, is it a better way to protect it if it's in a bar, if it's a certain type of creatine, maybe that have an effect. But none of those studies show any better effect than creatine monohydrate. So it comes down to money and market claim.
Another myth, out the door. So, Dr. Kreider, what's an unanswered question about creatine that you're most curious about? What finding do you think will change how creatine is viewed next? And if funding weren't a constraint, what would you study next?
Oh, great questions. What do I think is the next? I think the overall health benefit, especially in people who are impoverished or can't get enough quality nutrients per day, and how that might affect health outcomes, I think is a potential world health issue that might be beneficial. What was the next question?
What finding do you think will change how creatine is viewed next?
I think the more data we have on health benefits, the better creatine will be positioned as an acceptable dietary supplement to recommend for everyone throughout the lifespan. I think the data on the infants and third trimester pregnancy, my gut's telling me that creatine may be the next folate.
Wow.
Folate, okay? A lot more studies need to be done on it. It's coming out. Everything looks very positive. But I think that can be revolutionary, especially if we find that not only during the third trimester, but the first few years of life, to make sure it's in breast milk or infant formulas. Moms continue to take creatine during breastfeeding, infant formulas, and in foods as kids grow. That may have a huge impact in quality of health as kids grow. And then the third one was,
if funding, if you could study anything, right, what would you study next?
all right, I got that opportunity. So a few years ago, a company foundation called Wood Next Foundation. They are like a Bill Gates type of foundation, but they are the makers of Roku, which is a popular TV added things you can stream and things on. They are Aggies, meaning they're from Texas A&M, and they approach universities and say, we're really interested in active nutrition and health. Who on campus is doing that work? They said, oh, Kreider, of course we're doing this, right? And so they said, if we gave you funds, what would you do with those funds? And here's what we're doing. We're doing creatine and GAA supplementation as active nutrition and aging work. We're extending our sports nutrition into active nutrition. Sport nutrition is now active nutrition as we age.
Right.
And so we're taking 45 to 75-year individuals. We're giving them creatine, putting them in an exercise and a weight loss program. And we're looking at how creatine can help maintain muscle mass, improve cognition, improve health outcomes in individuals who exercise as well as people who do not. And we're adding GAA as the next thing. And then we're adding different nootropics to affect brain health, like curcumin as an anti-inflammatory, fish oil or omega-3 fatty acids to help protect brain integrity and reduce oxidative stress, and things to enhance cognitive neural activity, things like acetylcholine. So we are layering different nootropics on top of creatine and GAA to try to optimize brain function, health function, physical function as we get older, with the idea of slowing the onset of aging effects. Then the next step, and these studies are showing positive effects, next step is, what about a person who has mild cognitive impairment? They already noticing memory issues. They're first line being diagnosed by the doctor that they really do have a problem. And we give them medication, and maybe an alternate treatment could be, or an adjunctive treatment could be, some creatine GA and some of these other nutritional approaches to help slow the advancement of MCI into Alzheimer's and those type of things. So we're trying to optimize health. So we had that opportunity, and we're very fortunate being funded right now, and the money's gifted, so we can do whatever we think and go whatever direction. That's like the researcher's dream. Okay. So that's kind of cool that we're doing that now.
Congratulations on that, Dr. Kreider. I'm sure that's very deserving. It's not easy to get to that level where you have basically full discretion to study that. So I'm super excited to study more about, what you find there. And congratulations, wishing you guys and your team, a lot of success there, because I know with all the work you guys are doing, it's really going to reach millions of people and really change a lot of lives. So, wishing you a lot of success there.
Yeah,
if you were
follow up on that. That's probably one of the most rewarding things, is that, we've done exercise programs, training. We work with Curves. That was international and had, 75 countries, and they did our fitness and stuff. But creatine, one of the founders, Roger Harris, who did the initial studies on creatine and muscle, he passed away about a year ago. We just had a tribute to him at Cambridge. And I was asked to do the tribute about his work on creatine. And he had a quote early on in the creatine research that one day everybody will be taking creatine. And it's coming to fruition. Millions and millions of people over the last 30 years have benefited from creatine supplementation, from the basic studies that started in the early 90s and what they did in England, we did in the United States, a few others. And to see it now expanding into worldwide use, it's been pretty rewarding to see, and something you don't see too often in the field like this.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm sure he'd be very proud and very supportive of your work. You're really one of the champions here for creatine and getting this into the hands of, even more people, right? I just feel like everybody, there's so much room to expand from here, in kids and infants and pregnant women and, just a whole population. So, I'm sure the university is super supportive, and, I'm sure they are very, honored to have you there. And, I'm honored to speak to you, and I'm honored to continue to follow your work, because I know it's just going to only improve society and make us stronger as a whole. And, with the advancements and all this technology, that the space is in the right hands, and those funds are going to be very well put to use, especially if you're leading that project. So thank you. So last question here. If you were designing a system around human energy, what would it prioritize, and what is the biggest gap between research and real life right now?
What would I emphasize? Probably the most important thing is physical activity.
Okay.
Because physical activity is the best way to optimize the energy systems, the ability to produce energy, and to be able to recover. And so physical activity is the basis. That's why our lab's exercise and sport nutrition lab. And so I think that's the basic. Getting people physically active as they age, in particular, keeping active levels, is really the key. Then smart nutrition. On top of that, exercise plus nutrition equals performance and health. And so that's the focus that we're trying to do. You can't optimize health without exercise. You can't optimize health without good nutrition. And so all those things work together to improve quality of life.
That's amazing. Dr. Kreider, thank you. This is exactly what Feel More Energy is about, understanding the system so people can stop guessing. This conversation opens the door to a much bigger system: sleep, stress, recovery, cognition, and aging. And that's what we'll keep unpacking here. Hopefully I can interview you in the future again, and you can update us on all your wonderful projects and, new research that you've been uncovering. It's been a real pleasure. Where can people support you, or, where would you want people to go to find more about, your research and support you?
Yeah, creatineforhealth.com is a good place. Then our lab, exercise and sport nutrition lab.com, and we have a Facebook page. So follow us on Facebook, and you can stay up with all the latest cool things we're doing. The other thing I would say is follow the International Society of Sport Nutrition Facebook and publications. I'm one of the founders, and we're always putting out position stands and helping people understand the literature. And that's really important for the average person to understand, well, why is creatine helpful? Why is essential amino acids important? We now have position stands for all these things. So that's the other places they go to the ISSN.
Absolutely. We'll link some of those resources down below. Dr. Kreider, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure, and we'll speak soon.
Take care.
Thank you so much. Energy is a system, and this was just one part of building real energy. Stay with us. Subscribe so you don't miss what's next. And when you're ready to apply it, build your system at feelmoreenergy.com. Drop your biggest takeaway below. I read every comment. Keep building, and I'll see you next time.